Hey guys, welcome to AP Biology with Mr. Jones. Today we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycling. So by the end of this lesson, I hope that you have an understanding of what biogeochemical cycling actually is and understand the hydrological cycle and the carbon cycle. We'll save the nitrogen cycle and phosphorus cycle for another video. So what is biogeochemical cycling? Biogeochemical cycling refers to any of the natural pathways by which elements of living matter are circulated. And the law of conservation of mass states that matter can neither be created or destroyed. So this means that since for the most part Earth is a closed system with the exception of random space debris coming in, we have to continually recycle matter in order for new life and land to be created. All of the energy to do this cycling is coming from the sun, with the exception of a little bit that's coming from geothermal. That's heat in the earth left over from its formation. All right, so let's look at the hydrological cycle. The hydrological cycle, or the water cycle, is the process by which water moves on, above, and through the surface of the earth. And all that happens using energy derived from the sun. When we look at the water cycle as a whole, I think it makes sense to start in the ocean, but because it's a cycle, we could really start anywhere. Oceans are our largest reservoir for water resources on Earth, containing about 97% of the planet's water supply. And energy from the sun is going to heat the water molecules on the surface of the ocean and cause them to evaporate and enter the atmosphere as water vapor. Water vapor is going to condense and form clouds, which can be blown by wind. That wind is also a result of energy from the sun. And then when that water, when those clouds reach some sort of critical mass, that water is going to fall as precipitation to the Earth's surface. So that could be rain or hail or sleet. Once that water hits the Earth's surface, it's going to start to move down or continue to move down to the lowest point, which is ultimately the ocean. But on the way, it could be taken up by a plant, it could be consumed by an animal, or it could evaporate. It could end up in a pond or a river and evaporate directly back into the atmosphere. Plants take up water through their roots and then release that water as vapor through their leaves. And again, then return that water back to the atmosphere. Animals, on the other hand, drink water. They consume water and we respire, so your breath, if you're wearing a mask right now, you might feel that moisture on the inside of your mask. Or if you've ever been outside on a cold day and you can see your breath, that's water leaving your body. We also excrete water as urine, and that would continue downstream with the rest of the water that hasn't been taken up or evaporated in one of these ways until it hits the lowest point, and that's the ocean. As water moves downhill, it starts to erode away at rocks and dissolve the minerals that it's moving through. And as we go from the start to the finish of that journey, it's picking up a lot of minerals and salts. And so over billions of years, water has flowed downstream to the oceans, carrying all these solutes. And that's why our ocean is so salty, because when the water then evaporates out of the ocean, it evaporates as pure water and leaves all of those minerals and salts behind. All right, let's talk about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle can really be broken down into two distinct cycles: the fast or biological carbon cycle and the slow or geological carbon cycle. They happen at two different time scales, but obviously interact, and we'll talk about them both individually and together. We'll start with the fast carbon cycle. The fast carbon cycle, or the biological carbon cycle, is the interchange of carbon among living organisms through cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So let's imagine we're in a nice field and there's a nice sheep in that field. The tree is going to go through the process of photosynthesis, absorbing carbon dioxide and converting that into sugars. Those sugars can then be consumed by other animals, like the sheep, or they can be used again by the tree as energy in its own cellular function. And that process is called cellular respiration. And it breaks those sugars down and turns them into energy, and CO2 and water is a byproduct of that process as well. I should also note that when organisms die, their bodies are broken down, and the carbon that is stored as proteins or starches are released back into the atmosphere through cellular respiration that's accomplished by the bacteria and fungi that break those organisms down. And that's what typically happens, but not always, and that's how we get to the slow carbon cycle. So in the slow carbon cycle, or the geological carbon cycle, we can start with that matter, those living things being buried or sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And those are low oxygen environments, and decomposition can be incomplete there. So with the heat and pressure, either underground or at the bottom of the ocean, over long periods of time, sedimentary rock can be formed, natural gas, coal, oil, all of those things that we think of as fossil fuels can be formed. And typically they're locked away there. We call those carbon sinks because they're these big sources of carbon that last in that form for a long time and don't return to what we think of as the fast carbon cycle. And with the exception of volcanic eruptions, naturally, there's not a lot moving that carbon back into the system. Volcanic eruptions can produce about 200 million tons of carbon, or release that carbon annually. But typically, most of that carbon is locked away for quite a long time. Humans have really negatively impacted and disrupted the carbon cycle, especially the slow carbon cycle. So mining fossil fuels and burning them, we release over 120 times more carbon than volcanic eruptions every year. So all that carbon that was sequestered and locked away and not part of the fast carbon cycle is now being released into the atmosphere. And we also impact the fast carbon cycle by cutting trees, deforestation, removing those living organisms that can also sequester carbon through biomass. And there are scientists that think one of the fastest ways and simplest ways to start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is planting a lot of trees. So not necessarily a super high-tech solution to a pretty big problem. I have a couple of images. This is mountaintop removal mining. So this is an example of humans pulling carbon that has been sequestered as coal out of the earth and then burning it. So it's one thing to pull it out. That doesn't necessarily release the carbon. It's the burning of those fossil fuels that actually converts that resource back into carbon dioxide. Okay, so hopefully after that you guys have a good idea about what biogeochemical cycling is and how the hydrological and carbon cycle work, where the major reservoirs for water and carbon exist, and how the steps of each of those cycles can move forward. Today we're going to talk about